Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. In the follow-up to the best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning Less, a novel, the awkward and lovable Arthur Less returns in an unforgettable road trip across America in Andrew Sean Greer's new novel, Less is Lost. For Arthur Less, life is going surprisingly well. He's a moderately accomplished novelist in a steady relationship with his partner, Freddie. But nothing lasts. The death of an old lover and a sudden financial crisis has Less running away from his problems yet again, as he accepts a series of literary gigs that send him on a zigzagging adventure across the United States. Andrew Sean Greer is the author of 6 works of fiction, including the bestsellers The Confessions of Max Tivoli and Less. He is the recipient of an NEA grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It is a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Sean Greer to this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us. A delight to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
What is it like to have a really successful book, have a lot of pressure to write a sequel, and then actually do it?
You mean in the middle of a pandemic and a storm of political activity?
Yeah, that.
I have to say the outside pressure was minimal. The inner pressure was just about the same as with any book, which is that total failure and then seeing the light and following through.
So how do you define total failure?
Total failure is the despair of looking at the 200 pages you've spent a year working on and saying, this is awful. Tell the publisher it's not going to happen. That happens every time with me. That seems to be part of the process.
Why didn't it work? I mean, you did that, right? I mean, you had how many pages? And then you said, okay, this isn't working. This is not going where I'm going, and I can't get out of this.
I had 100 pages. It was not a novel with Arthur Less. It was a road trip novel, and it was just awful. The characters were wooden. It was too sentimental. It was just awful. And that's when I had to just submit to the idea that maybe I really wanted to write with this narrator, this protagonist I already had, and that would be my way in, and it was.
Once you started that, with that in mind, did things go along much more swimmingly in the sense of you knew quickly you had made the right decision?
I mean, I knew aesthetically I'd made the right decision, but I think my agent was none too pleased that I had made that decision. She thought it was unseemly.
What's unseemly about it? Everyone does it.
Well, I think there's an idea. I mean, already I'm an unlikely Pulitzer Prize winner. And then you're not supposed to follow that with a sequel. This is the highest literary prize in America. You're supposed to let that go and let it have its gold stamp on it and write something else. But I mean, I just couldn't let it go.
When you say unlikely, I mean, that's because a comic novel does not usually win the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, it's not known for that. I think the one before me was A Confederacy of Dunces, which must have been 30 years before.
So when you were even in the running, did you just think, okay, well, this is nice. This is as far as this will go?
Oh, there's not nice. Even there's no in the running. They don't tell you. They just announce it.
Yes.
At like a luncheon. So I was not aware of when the Pulitzer Prize was announced. Like that is not something that is on my radar. I know now. It's April. If anyone is curious. Turns out it's late April. So it came completely out of the blue.
So there's no finalists or a list that comes out or nomination. It's just out of the blue.
I mean, actually, that's what's nice about it, because you don't want to set writers in competition with each other, because we're not in competition. We spent 5 years alone writing something, and then good luck to it. So they announced the finalists after. And okay. One of them was a close friend of mine, Elif Batuman. And if we had known we were the finalists, I think that might have been charged somehow. But if it's after the fact, we're fine.
So when you decide then to take on these characters again, as you said this a moment ago, you know them, you had a feel for them, and you also knew something that you didn't know when writing the first book, was that people really dig these characters.
I definitely did not know that. And that is something that, for all the evils of social media, for writers and maybe other artists who don't get to be like composers who hear the applause at the end, we have no idea what readers are experiencing. But through Instagram, I was hearing from people around the world, young readers who were really moved by it. And that is both lovely, but then a responsibility if you're carrying these characters into another story. So to answer your earlier question and contradict myself, yeah, I did start to feel that near the end.
Well, first of all, the book is hilariously funny and just such a delight to read. I'm curious as to, even when I think of the first novel, just the pacing of this is just perfect, and how you felt setting the metronome for yourself in writing a book like this.
That is an astute question, because that is something no one ever talks about in writing school or literature class, which is pacing, which, especially for comedy, is the whole thing. And that it would be surprising to hear how many drafts I read where I moved paragraphs around or chapters around just to get, even after the book, I turned in the final draft a month later, I removed a chapter, which I think is illegal, but they let me do it. Because I was like, it's too slow. I was just, like, it has to be rollicking,
Yeah.
because otherwise people won't put up with the lyrical passages or the bad puns. It has to pull them forward.
The idea of having Freddie tell this tale is lovely. And so it's Freddie telling us about Arthur, and Freddie isn't there for most of it.
Well, that's true. I hope that won't baffle readers. I hope they just go with it. The idea is that Les tells them the details later, and he makes a book out of it with his imagination and his affection. But it gives me a great way of having distance from this character, Arthur Les, who admittedly is a lot like me. I can make fun of him lovingly and put in aspects of my life without it being a sort of, if Arthur told the story, I feel it would be self-pitying and obnoxious. But with Freddie, it's loving.
When you are writing, do you ever feel that you could go that way of self-pitying? Because the character, for want of a better term, it can be melancholy.
Yeah, he can. And we, hopefully, as readers, are just want to shake him and say, things are going great. Why are you? It's going to turn out fine. And I know, as the writer, that since it's a comedy, it's going to turn out fine. That's the fun of doing terrible things to him, because I'm going to reward him, like God and Job. I don't think Job's rewarded. Now that I think about it.
Well, I'm just curious that you think that you're doing terrible things to him. I mean, he gets into predicaments, but it's life, right? I mean, it's weird things that happen, and weird things happen to all of us.
Yeah, and I think also no one's mean to him particularly, except some literary figures who
Yep.
have their own take on things. But otherwise, he's such a sort of innocent, neutral presence that he sort of manages to escape disaster, even a hurricane.
Less is Lost is the name of the new novel. It is published by Little Brown. Yeah, there's a great scene in the novel where you're talking about the hurricane, where he's in a camper and just trying to like move the camper so he's sort of with the wind.
Well, I have to say, because I had to do that. I did rent a camper for 6 weeks. I was on the Atlantic coast in South Carolina, and the ranger came over and he was like, I'd face it right into the wind if I were you, so you don't get taken off. And I was like, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? I'm not prepared. We don't have hurricanes in California.
When you get to write about those moments of your life that I assume were not comedic, let's say they weren't comedic at the time, but then as you look back at them and say, oh, this would fit nicely here with this particular character in this particular situation.
I mean, that is what I do is I have a notebook and take down absolutely everything, thinking I'll make it into a funny story later. I don't necessarily realize it's funny at the time. In fact, most of us, in our days, like we
Right.
trip on the curb and it's embarrassing. But by the time we meet our friends for a drink, we can say, this funny thing happened to me today. We've made it into a funny story. And it's a way of getting rid of it. And that's sort of what happened to me on that trip.
Andrew Sean Greer is the author of Less is Lost, the book published by Little Brown. the idea that we like this character, I want to look at that for a moment of the reaction that you got after the first novel, and certainly with the paperback release where this book just took off.
No one was more shocked than I. And I think what was most like a couple nights ago in San Francisco, two 23-year-olds, twins, young women, came to me and they said they were such fans of Les when they were teenagers. And did I have any advice for them? And I thought, as a teenager, you loved a book about a man turning 50? Like, I just found that fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think it's something about transition. And then also because the books are about this incredibly innocent man, which I guess is unusual and appeals to people who don't want to grow up like me.
Well, sure, we all have that. And we suddenly find ourselves 50 and think, well, what the hell happened?
I certainly did.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. You look in the mirror and you're like, where's that guy? Who's this guy? I have an identical twin brother, and so I get to watch him and be like, boy, he's getting old. And he's looking at me the same way.
And you talk about that in the novel. I mean, you make that point a few times about, oh, look, it looks old or doesn't, or looks this age or looks that age. You think about that with this character.
I do. It's also because in the first Les book, it comes from a very serious idea, which is that my generation of gay men, we didn't get to watch another generation grow old because the generation ahead of us, so many died of AIDS or were closeted, and everyone was closeted before that. So we don't know what a gay man looks like over 50. You know, we're sort of making it up as we go along. And that's exciting because there's no template, but it's also a little terrifying. You have to find new ideas of what it means to be beautiful or authentic or strong that aren't about being 30.
When you say a new template, I mean, that just isn't for the writing, that's for living your life.
For living your life. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, but for me, as you can tell, it's also for the writing, it's to have a sense of humor about yourself, which is hard to have at 20, for me at least.
Without the depression and anxiety and all that.
Without the depression and anxiety. Now it's just hilarious what I did at
20. But did you ever want to go back and explore? I mean, you do a little bit, but did you ever want to go back and explore this character or these characters in their young adult and early adulthood?
The one thing I did put in this is Les's first kiss, which
right.
I have to be honest is precisely what my first kiss was. And it's so humiliating. I can't talk about it on radio, but it's also like the funniest story. I mean, of course, it was awful at the time, but it's a great example of something that is just like amazingly funny because it shouldn't happen to anyone ever. Not a first kiss. How could that be? It's true.
And yet, when we hear Les and Freddie and the conversation that they have with one another, their relationship is tested here in this novel, and even though they're not together geographically, they're communicating or not communicating and trying to read between the lines, and that can be fraught.
Yeah, I realized that this novel, this is the challenge of it. It's the after the happy ending love story and how that goes. And Freddie, who is 15 years younger than Les,
right.
is going through his own transition. He's in his mid to late 30s now. I think a lot of readers think of him as being like 22. He's not. He's like getting up there. And he has his own choices to make, and he's his own protagonist in his story. And I wanted to give him a lot more weight in this so that the relationship would be more balanced and not just about poor Arthur Les.
And without giving anything away, they both have temptations.
Yeah, I thought, I don't want anything terrible to happen, but I think it's normal to think, what if my life were different? Are there other people I could be with instead of this sad sack or this nagging English teacher?
The fact that Les is a writer, and the fact that when you wrote the first book, he is a middling writer, if you will, and then you turn out to not be anymore. Does that change the picture?
It is true that I can no longer draw from my own writing experiences as much, but I think I've got a rich past to take from.
A lot of years in the trenches.
Many years in the trenches. I mean, so many writers who were like, "I have been at a conference like that. I can't believe you captured it." And actually, a lot of things I in the literary world I make up because it's just clear to me how things go. It's feast or famine.
Yeah. It's a pretentious world, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is. And it's great to now be called a comic novelist because I am free of having to explain my book in existential terms or anything like that.
And when you look at there's part of the novel is like judging literary prizes of what that is like. You make it out to be a very important job that most people understand is kind of silly.
That has been my experience. I have been on some of those juries, and it's so important. It's life-changing for the people who receive the prize, like me. And in a way, I'm making fun of myself. I'm thinking, who knows how people come to the final decision? It's so arbitrary and strange, and this group of people. But I was on a prize where at the end of it, one person did tipsily admit to me, I didn't read any of the books. I figured the rest of you would make a great choice. Ah!
Like that you added tipsily, sure. And
Yes.
and you feel that way. I mean, I've heard authors say that time and again to me. Again, I say, "Oh, I read your blurb about this book," and they're like, "Oh, I don't know what that is. I never read it."
Yes, right. You read enough to know how to blurb it.
Less is Lost is the name of the new novel. I want to pick up on the idea of this being a road novel, and that this character is traveling around these United States. It seems that obviously there's a lot of things that you could have written about in the sense of putting a 50-year-old gay man on the road, and yet you tend to go more, and feel free to disagree with me, of course, but you tend to go more for the universal, just kind of pain in the neck aspect of trying to go from one place to the other and fit in.
Well, I think part of it is that I had a rule in writing less that I could not make fun of the people in the country he was visiting because Arthur's a thing out of place. Everyone there is acting normal.
Right.
It's not funny. So that's why the joke has to be on Arthur. He's the one with the funny accent and German. He's the one who doesn't know how to plug in something properly. And uh, so I kept that for this one. It had also kept me away from making any really strong political statements about parts of the country where they voted differently from me and people who certainly maybe wouldn't necessarily vote for my civil rights, but might like me in particular. I didn't want to make fun of those people. I wanted to be Arthur, who's ridiculous, and his own misconceptions about other parts of the country that he never thought about before.
Is that another way of saying that doing that is too easy? I mean, it's almost like, okay, that's an easy joke.
Well, I think also there's plenty of it around, and two, I'm not good at it. I, I'm not good at it. I mean, it's not that I don't get angry or rant. It's just I'm not an attractive person when I do it. So I have to go the other way just because you have to go where your talents lie and not where they don't.
Yeah, I can understand that, but it also makes the book sweeter, I think, because there isn't that. We get that in every aspect of our life. So when we're reading the novel, and this character is coming in, you certainly mention it, obviously, that he'll feel out of place, and yet it's just sweet that it's just him trying to figure out how to get out of the store with his head on right.
Well, because I think that's mostly if you're an anxious person, that's kind of the main thing going on. You're not worried about being murdered. You're worried about where you parked your car in the Walmart because you've never seen such a large parking lot in your life and you'd screwed up. That's those the small things are the ones that really get you, and they're the funny ones because they don't matter.
Tell us about Dolly.
Uh, well, it's in honor I of my black pug Olive, who sadly passed in January, 15 years old.
Sorry.
So I, of course, she was still alive when I was writing the book, and she was a hilarious companion for a long time. So I'm like, all right, you're going in the book. You take what you have around you.
And this, we should mention, is not Les's dog, but it is a dog that is loaned to him.
Well, I thought that would be funnier because, like, if
Much
it's your
funnier.
own dog, then it's like travels with Charlie. They love you, they're a companion. But if it's someone else's dog, especially a pug, they do not care about you at all. They have their own mischief.
The Hello Dolly joke is one
Ah.
of the best jokes in the entire book. I'll let people read it themselves because it has words in it that I can't say on the radio. But my God, it was funny.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's a slightly obscure joke. You never know what anyone's going to
Do you worry
get.
about that a lot of being too obscure?
I mean, I do. I should say, I do not know many of the words I put in this book. I have a thesaurus. I think Freddie is a better writer than it takes me 5 years to write what would seems to him to become naturally. So that's a writer's trick, right? But I think I try to go for high and low humor because both are really funny to me. And I think puns are some of actually the most sophisticated kind of humor, even people groan at them. But I think those kind of dad jokes have a universal quality. Good luck to my
Mm.
translators. There's slapstick in here, and there are literary references and I think whatever joke people get, they'll in whatever level they'll enjoy the book. You don't have to get them all.
The character of H Mandarin. So, I mean, I think we can assume where that comes from, but I'm curious as to where that came from your perspective, but also what kind of experience that you had that would have sparked that.
I still think it's funny that he has one H too many, too many. I mean, it's clearly, I took the name from George R. Martin, who
Right.
seems like a lovely person in interviews and is so talented. But the personality, who only is briefly in less, I thought of the generation of older male writers who I had contact with coming up as a mid-list writer back in the day when you were supposed to be a sort of gruff white male writer and a kind of a jerk. That was like what the great American novelist was. And Norman Mailery kind of folks. And I met a lot of those guys along the way, and I thought about them because their time has passed.
That idea of having that superstardom too, is that past, do you think, of having of that kind of literary figure? I mean, I guess it exists, but lesser than it used to be,
I
I
think
think.
the only like rock star writers who we have is David Sedaris.
Yeah.
Like, I think he could fill like a football stadium,
Yes.
and I think that's it. I think because also we've opened it up to lots of different writers getting their chance instead of just hearing from one every 4 years. We've leveled the playing field a little bit for the best.
I introduced David Sedaris once, and it's just insane because it was like Elton John. I've never seen anything like it.
I mean, he's giving them such joy and caustics, and he's a great storyteller, and he's subdued.
Yeah.
And I once opened for him. He was very kind. He lets writers open for him to
Yes.
kind of like push our books. And I had like 5 minutes in front of that audience, and I have never been in front of a crowd like that. They would laugh at anything I said. It was that energy I've never really felt before. And so, except when I've interviewed like Stephen King and Anne Rice in front of their fans, and having that energy directed at you of people who were so in love with a writer. I use that in the scenes where he is in front of an audience with
Yeah.
Les.
I thought about that because I've introduced both those authors, Anne Rice and Stephen King,
Right.
and it's just fascinating because there's such love and such understanding, and they like you just because somehow you got roped into doing that, and they feel that, okay, you must have been endorsed some way.
Yeah, that is sweet. And they're Anne Rice. Everyone was dressed in like
Oh
Victorian
yeah.
vampire. It was fantastic. And she was incredibly sweet. She was a really sweet, generous person.
Are you right now thinking about the next novel? Are you worried about it? Are you still anxious? Or because when I asked you, you said like I'm good now. So how long does this period of now last you?
Oh, this is great because I have started the new novel and I'm in the honeymoon period because I try to start a book before the next one comes out so you don't have all your eggs in one basket. You're already thinking like, oh, well, I have a better book that I'm already writing. So I'm in the point where I'm like, this is going to be the best thing anyone has ever written. I can't believe it's going to be so easy for me this time. And we all know that none of those things are true, but there's still a glow of early days about it.
Were you spooked by the 100 pages that didn't go anywhere, that could happen again?
That will happen again. But it doesn't, it's sometimes it's not the first 100 pages. Somehow it's like sometimes the last or in the middle, but something goes wrong and I have a nervous breakdown and then I figure it out and I have to submit to the novel that actually is happening in my hands and not the one I planned. So I'm sure that will happen too, but not yet.
No, not yet. And now you get to hear people say nice things about you and your new book, which seems like will be pleasant for a while.
Yeah, this is a very pleasant period. I have to say, I'll enjoy every minute because we all know it's not for always.
Again, Andrew Sean Greer's new novel is Less is Lost. It is published by Little Brown. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us